Valkyria Revolution is technically set within the universe of the Valkyria Chronicles series of tactical RPGs, but it has little in common with those games. Instead, it's more like a Dynasty Warriors style RPG with a moderately enjoyable combat system, which might be fine if it weren't burdened with far too many long, poorly animated cutscenes with frequent loading screens. This is the tale of a tiny nation's revolution for independence from an empire, framed as a conversation between a student and his professor a century in the future. The professor tells the true story of the war, as opposed to the version that's been accepted by history, and it cleverly lets you revisit old cutscenes by looking through the professor's scrapbook. The problem is not so much the content of the story, but how it's told. Valkyria Revolution often feels as though it is 3/4 painfully bad cutscenes and 1/4 gameplay. Some of these cutscenes drag on for as long as 15 minutes, but only rarely does the action rise above watching a bunch of characters standing around a table with nothing moving but their mouths. Often, you won't even see the speaker's face as the camera is pointed at the back of their heads, as though to save on even that animation. Also, you either have to sit through the whole cutscene or skip it entirely. There's no option to skip over lines of dialogue if you've read the subtitles faster than the character speaks them. Adding insult to injury, an endless parade of short loading screens interrupts the flow as one cutscene transitions to another. The action-oriented combat doesn't do much to make up for it. It has its moments, particularly when you jump into the midst of a bunch of enemy soldiers with Amleth, he of the imitation Buster Sword, and cut them all down in one tidy swing. But there's very little in the way of variation. It's always about jumping into maps with often low-resolution textures, plowing through a bunch of bad guys, and then beating a boss. The ability to switch between up to 4 squad mates of different classes makes battles a little more interesting, as do the flashy animations that contrast so starkly with the stodginess of the cutscenes. But outside of those moments, you start to see the many other flaws, such as the way sidearms like rifles feel almost worthless compared to the big melee weapons wielded by the heroes. As for the enemies themselves, each new one rarely looks much different from the last, and they all stand around waiting for you to hit them. Magic was in short supply in Valkyria Chronicles, but here it's everywhere. The resulting spells add spice to the combat with fireballs or tremors that erupt beneath enemies' feet, and Revolution tries to wedge in a dash of Chronicles' tactical combat by forcing you to press the triangle button every time you use them to stop combat. Like so much about Revolution, it's a nice touch in theory, but the constant juggling ruins the flow of combat. On top of that, an emotional combat system attempts to add depth by striking fear into the hearts of your enemies with swift surprise attacks and lowering the defense, but it rarely seems beneficial enough to warrant tactical consideration. Valkyria Revolution drowns in this shallowness. Unlike Valkyria Chronicles, there is little to distinguish it from the mass of generic Japanese RPGs already available, and at times it almost comes off as a parody. It's entertaining enough, partly thanks to the broad strokes of its story, but it's also eminently forgettable. So much of what made the Valkyria series great, the cel-shaded hand-drawn art style and the roughly realistic world where magic feels almost as otherworldly as it would in our own, gets cast aside in favor of 3D models that would look more at home in Star Ocean and magic that's as common as booze in a frat house. It's a revolution that's better read about than experienced. Valkyria Revolution tells a decent tale of war, but the strength of that story is dulled by overlong, boring, and poorly animated cutscenes. It sacrifices the unique historical setting and art style of the Valkyria Chronicles series proper in favor of generic JRPG elements that fail to leave a strong impression. And its hack-and-slash combat offers little in the way of strategy and ruins its flow with a misguided magic system. For more video game reviews, stay tuned to IGN.